It was a quiet afternoon when the knock came, the kind of soft but firm tap that makes you pause and listen twice. The street outside was still. A few kids were playing down the block and a delivery truck had just driven off. Inside his house, Jake Lawson was finishing his coffee, enjoying the peace that came with early retirement. For once, life felt simple. No missions, no orders, no noise. Just him, his house, and a yard that needed mowing. When the knock came again, Jake set the mug down and walked to the door. Through the small window, he saw two men standing on the porch. They wore dark blue shirts tucked into khaki pants and had shiny badges clipped to their belts. One held a clipboard, the other a folder. The badges said HOA Compliance Officer. Jake raised an eyebrow. He didn't remember ever seeing HOA officers dressed like that. He opened the door halfway. "Afternoon," the taller man said. "We're from the Homeowners Association. We're doing a quick compliance inspection." Jake nodded slowly. "Didn't know there was one scheduled." "It's a new policy," the man replied with a practiced smile. "We're checking for code issues, unregistered vehicles, and, restricted items." The second man, shorter and younger, shifted his weight. He looked nervous. His eyes kept moving from the doorframe to Jake to something behind him in the hallway. Jake caught that. Years in the Navy had taught him to read micro-expressions, tiny signals most people never notice. Something about their stance wasn't right. Still, Jake stayed polite. "You got paperwork for this inspection?" "Of course," the tall one said quickly, flipping a few pages on the clipboard. "Right here." Jake glanced at the document. It had the HOA logo, but the text looked off. The print was blurry, like it had been copied too many times. And there was no signature from the HOA president, something every official notice was supposed to have. Jake opened the door a bit wider. "You can come to the porch. I don't want dirt tracked in." "What exactly are you looking for?" The younger man spoke this time. "We received a report about firearms on the property. It's against HOA regulations to store certain weapons within residential limits." Jake paused. His face stayed calm, but inside, alarms went off. There were no HOA rules about firearms. In fact, the HOA had no authority over personal gun ownership. It was something Jake had double-checked when he bought the house. He took a step back, giving himself space while pretending to think. "That's interesting," he said evenly. "Didn't realize the board passed a new rule." The taller one nodded quickly. "Yes, just last month. We're making sure all residents are in compliance." Jake noticed how he avoided eye contact when speaking. His tone sounded rehearsed, not official. "Do you mind showing me the exact regulation?" Jake asked. The tall man flipped through his clipboard again, pretending to look for something. The younger one stayed quiet, watching Jake carefully. After a few seconds, Jake smiled politely. "Tell you what, let me grab my HOA handbook. I just want to be sure we're looking at the same information." He turned toward the hallway, walked calmly into his office, and closed the door halfway. Then his expression hardened. His instincts were shouting now. He sat at his desk and opened his security app. With a few taps, every camera around the property started recording, including the porch camera that faced both men. He zoomed in. Their badges were shiny, but the laminate around the edges was peeling. The younger one was whispering something to the other, who shook his head. Then the tall one looked straight at the camera, only for a second, but long enough to confirm Jake's suspicion. These guys weren't from the HOA. Jake reached for his phone and texted a friend, a local police sergeant. "Two men posing as HOA officers. Suspicious behavior. At my door now. Cameras on. No confrontation yet." The reply came almost instantly. "Hold tight. Units nearby. Don't engage." Jake set the phone down and took a breath. Then he put his calm face back on and returned to the door. "Sorry about that," he said casually. "Couldn't find the handbook, but I'm sure we can sort this out." "You said someone reported me?" The tall man nodded again. "Yes, sir. A neighbor, anonymous report." Jake said, leaning against the doorframe. "And you said something about restricted firearms?" "That's right," the younger man said quickly. "We just need to verify that everything here is compliant. If we can take a quick look inside, we'll be out of your hair." Jake smiled faintly. "I'm afraid that's not how this works. HOA inspections don't involve entering private property. You can inspect the exterior, sure, but not inside my home." The two men exchanged a glance. The taller one tried to regain confidence. "Sir, we have the authority." Jake cut him off gently but firmly. "No, you don't. The HOA can issue fines for grass length and mailbox color. That's about it. So why don't you tell me who sent you? The air went still. The younger man's hand twitched near his waist. Jake noticed it, subtle but sharp. His training told him that kind of movement could mean a weapon, or just panic. Either way, he stayed ready, every muscle alert under his calm expression. You seem tense, Jake said quietly. Something wrong? The younger one forced a laugh. No, sir. Just doing our job. Jake's gaze didn't waver. Funny, because if you were really HOA, you'd have no reason to be nervous. There was a long pause. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. A lawnmower buzzed faintly. The taller man sighed and adjusted his collar. Look, we can come back later, he said finally. Maybe after you check with the board. Sure, Jake said evenly. Why don't you leave your contact information and I'll follow up? They hesitated. The tall one reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Jake accepted it and immediately noticed it was blank on the back, something HOA cards never were. Appreciate your time, Jake said politely, stepping back. I'll contact the board myself. The men nodded awkwardly and turned to leave. They walked briskly to their car, an unmarked dark sedan parked at the curb. Jake watched as they got in and drove away, tires crunching softly against the asphalt. When the car turned the corner, Jake exhaled slowly. His phone buzzed again. It was the police sergeant patrol car in the area. They'll circle and check plates, Jake typed back. Got video. Sending now. He transferred the footage from his home system to a secure folder and shared the clip. Then he sat down on the porch step, rubbing his hands together slowly. The breeze was light, but his mind was racing. He'd spent years overseas reading people, anticipating danger before it happened. The way those men moved, spoke, avoided his eyes, it all told a story. They weren't officials. They were testing him. He stood up and walked around the property, scanning for anything unusual. The gate was slightly ajar. He was sure he had closed it earlier. In the grass near the fence, he found a fresh boot print, heavier and wider than his own. Someone had been snooping around before the knock. By the time the patrol car rolled up 15 minutes later, Jake was waiting at the curb. The officer stepped out, nodded, and asked a few quick questions. Jake showed him the badge photos, the fake paperwork, the blank business card. The officer confirmed there were no registered HOA inspections that day, and no new regulations on firearms. Looks like they're pretending to be compliance officers, the officer said. We've had a few reports like this lately. Usually they target older folks or people who live alone. Jake nodded slowly. These guys picked the wrong house. The officer smiled slightly. Seems that way. After giving his statement, Jake went back inside. He double-checked the locks, then sat down at the kitchen table. The house felt quiet again, but a different kind of quiet now. Alert, aware. He looked around at the walls. The photos of his unit, the folded flag in its wooden case. He had thought he left danger behind when he left the Navy. Turns out sometimes danger wears a fake badge and shows up right at your front door. He poured another cup of coffee, staring out the window at the street. The sun was starting to dip, painting the houses in warm gold light. Across the road, a neighbor waved while bringing in her mail. Jake waved back, forcing a small smile. Everything looked normal again, but his instincts didn't rest. Something told him those two men weren't done. Maybe they'd come back, maybe they wouldn't. But either way, he was ready. The difference now was simple. They had tried to test the wrong person. Inside, the camera light blinked red, steady, recording, watching. Jake took one last sip of coffee and said quietly to himself, "Let's see what you're really up to." That night, Jake barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of those two men standing on his porch. Something about the way they had looked at him stayed in his mind. It wasn't curiosity or confusion, it was calculation. They hadn't come to ask questions. They'd come to find something. By morning, he had already reviewed the security footage 3 times. Every detail mattered, the way the taller one kept scanning the side yard, the younger one glancing toward the garage. They weren't just pretending to be HOA officers, they were searching for something specific. He paused the video and zoomed in on their car. The license plate was a little dirty but still visible. He sent the image to his police contact and added a short message. "This is the car they used. Any updates?" He left it at that, trying not to overthink. The morning light spilled through the blinds, catching the dust floating in the air. It was peaceful again, but it didn't feel safe. Jake decided to take a slow walk around the neighborhood. He wanted to see if anyone else had been approached. As he walked, neighbors waved like usual. A few were working on their lawns, another was washing his car. Everything looked normal. He stopped to chat with Mrs. Carter, who lived 2 doors down. She was in her garden, trimming flowers with her wide-brimmed hat tilted against the sun. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he said, smiling. "Well, good morning." "Jake, you're out early," she replied, glancing up. "Yeah, couldn't sleep much," he said lightly. "Hey, quick question. Did anyone from the HOA stop by here yesterday?" She shook her head. "No, not that I remember." "Why, is something going on?" "Maybe nothing," he said carefully. "Just some people claiming to be from the HOA came by my place. Thought I'd check." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Strange. I haven't heard about any inspections. I'd know if they were doing one." "You know I'm on the board, right?" Jake nodded. "That's what I thought. These two said there was a new policy about firearms." Mrs. Carter laughed out loud, a little startled. "Firearms? That's not something we handle. We deal with paint colors, fence heights, and trash bins. Not personal property like that." "That's what I figured," Jake said. She frowned now. "Did they come inside your home?" "No," Jake replied. "I didn't let them. I've got some of it on camera. Already sent it to the police." "Good," she said firmly. "Something's off. I'll check with the rest of the board, but I can tell you there's no such inspection." Jake thanked her and kept walking. The air was warm, and the smell of fresh-cut grass filled the street. It was strange, he thought, how normal everything looked when trouble was hiding underneath. By the time he got home, his phone buzzed. A message from his police contact popped up. "Car traced. Stolen plates. Be careful. We're looking into possible impersonation ring." Jake stared at the message for a long second. Impersonation ring. That explained the fake badges, the paperwork, the nervous energy. It also meant there were probably more of them, and they might not be finished. He spent the next hour tightening up his home security system. He double-checked the cameras, updated the alarm settings, and even repositioned one of the front yard lights to catch clearer footage if anyone came back. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being prepared. Later that day, while Jake was cleaning up the garage, he noticed something small wedged under the side of his workbench. It looked like a small piece of black plastic. He picked it up and realized it was part of a wireless earpiece, broken off maybe during the visit. He turned it over in his hand. That detail made his stomach tighten. Whoever those guys were, they hadn't just shown up out of curiosity. They were equipped. That wasn't random. He put the piece in a small bag and set it aside. Another message came through on his phone, this time from Mrs. Carter. "I talked to the board. No new inspections, no firearm policy, no new officers. Be careful. I'll alert the others," Jake thanked her. His mind was already piecing together what might come next. He had seen this kind of thing before, back when he was deployed. Groups pretending to be something harmless to gain access, test reactions, or scout targets. It was never random. That evening, as the sun began to sink and the shadows stretched across the street, Jake sat on the porch again. He watched the neighborhood like he used to watch distant horizons from ship decks. Calm, still, but always scanning. A car passed slowly down the street. He noticed it right away. Same model, same color as before. It didn't stop, but it drove slower than usual, like the driver was looking for something. Jake leaned back slightly and watched it through narrowed eyes. The car turned the corner and disappeared. He waited a few minutes, then went inside. His instincts were telling him that this wasn't over. Later that night, while reviewing footage again, he noticed something chilling. The same car had passed by 3 times that day. Different hours, same route, same slow crawl past his house. It wasn't just coincidence. He saved the clips, labeled them by time, and sent them to his police contact again. This time, he added a short note. "They're watching." The next morning, Jake received a call from the sergeant himself. "You weren't wrong," the man said. "We've had reports of a group doing exactly what you described. They pretend to be HOA or code officers to get inside houses. If the owner lets them in, they distract them while someone else searches rooms or takes valuables. We think they might be linked to a larger theft operation." Jake listened quietly. "So they're not small-time scammers?" "Doesn't look like it," the sergeant said. "We're putting a unit on watch around your neighborhood. Just keep an eye out." "You did good not letting them in." "Appreciate that," Jake said. I'll stay alert." After hanging up, he walked through the house, taking a slow look at every window and door. He wasn't afraid. Fear was something he'd learned to handle a long time ago. But this was his home now, not a base. And these weren't soldiers. They were people who thought they could intimidate others for easy gain. He couldn't let that happen here. Not in his neighborhood. That afternoon, he made a few quiet visits to his closest neighbors, just the ones he trusted. He didn't want to scare anyone, but he wanted them aware. "There might be people pretending to be from the HOA," he explained. "If anyone comes to your door claiming that, don't let them in. Call the police first." Some looked surprised, others concerned. But all thanked him. Word spread quickly, just the way he hoped. By the end of the day, the entire block knew to be cautious. Jake felt better knowing that much. Still, something deep down told him the men would come back. Maybe not right away. Maybe not even this week. But people like that didn't like being challenged. That night, he turned off the lights and sat near the window with the curtains drawn, just watching. The streetlights glowed softly outside. The air was still. Around midnight, a faint engine sound broke the silence. He peeked through the curtain and saw headlights creeping around the corner. The same car again. It slowed near his driveway, paused for a moment, then rolled on. Jake watched until it vanished into the distance. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe for a few seconds. Then he picked up his phone and recorded a short voice note, calm and steady. They came by again. Same car, no attempt to stop, just passing. Probably checking if I'm alone or if I reacted. He saved the note and set his phone down. His mind was sharp now, focused. If they came back, he'd be ready, not with anger. Not with aggression, but with control. For a long while, he just sat there in the quiet house, listening to the distant hum of the street and the ticking of the kitchen clock. It was strange how peaceful moments could hold so much tension underneath. Finally, as dawn began to break and the first light crept through the blinds, he said softly to himself, "If they come again, I'll know what to do." The house was still. The world outside looked calm again. But Jake knew better than to mistake calm for safety. He had learned that lesson years ago, and it was as true now as ever. He poured himself another cup of coffee and looked out over the yard. The same street, the same trees, the same routine, but now everything felt different. Someone had tested his door once, and they might try again, but this time he'd be waiting. The next few days were quiet, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. Every sound outside made Jake's attention snap to the window. A car door slamming, footsteps on the sidewalk, even a delivery truck idling too long near his driveway. He noticed it all. The silence wasn't rest anymore. It was the pause before something else happened. Still, he tried to keep his days normal. He mowed the lawn, cleaned the gutters, and helped an older neighbor fix a broken mailbox. But even while doing small chores, part of his mind stayed alert. It was an old habit, one that never left him after his years of service. You could take a man out of the Navy, but you couldn't take the watchfulness out of him. One morning, as he was trimming a hedge along the side of the house, he spotted something odd near the edge of the property line. It was a small scrap of duct tape stuck to the fence post, barely visible unless you looked closely. He peeled it off. Underneath was a faint mark, like someone had scratched the wood intentionally. It wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. A sign. He looked around slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line and the quiet street. Nothing. No movement. No cars parked strangely. Still, he knew what this kind of mark could mean. In some places, burglars or scouts used simple signs like that to identify houses, whether someone lived there, whether it was worth targeting or if it was checked. He took out his phone and snapped a picture. Then he removed the tape completely and burned it in a small metal bucket near the garage. No point leaving clues behind for whoever thought they were being clever. That afternoon, he drove to the local police station. The sergeant met him in the lobby. They shook hands, and Jake laid out the photo, the earpiece piece he had found earlier, and his notes about the car that kept driving by. The sergeant nodded as he looked everything over. "We've been tracking this group for weeks," he said. "They're organized. They use fake IDs, fake paperwork, sometimes even fake police badges. They target neighborhoods with low security, older residents, or people who live alone." Jake crossed his arms. "So they're scouting?" "Exactly," the sergeant said. "They test reactions first. If you open the door and let them in, they take mental notes about what you have. Cars, valuables, security systems. Sometimes they come back later. Sometimes they send someone else, Jake's jaw tightened. They've already tested the wrong door. The sergeant smiled faintly. Yeah, I think you gave them a scare. Still, we'll keep a patrol near your street for a bit. After leaving the station, Jake stopped by a local hardware store. He picked up a few things: extra motion sensors, brighter floodlights, and a set of fake security signs. He knew from experience that deterrence worked best when layered. Most criminals looked for easy targets. He planned to make sure his house wasn't one of them. That night, he installed the new equipment. The yard lit up like a quiet fortress when he tested the lights. Each camera was synced and recording. Inside, he sat on the couch, reviewing the live feeds one by one. The faint hum of electronics filled the air. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when his phone vibrated. A notification flashed. Motion detected. Driveway. Jake looked at the screen. A car had stopped just past the mailbox. Its headlights were off, but the shape was unmistakable. It was the same dark sedan from before. His pulse stayed steady, but his mind sharpened. He watched the live feed closely. The car idled there for almost a full minute, then slowly pulled away. Jake watched until it turned the corner and disappeared. He replayed the clip twice, zooming in. Same car, same damage near the front bumper, same license plate. They were definitely watching again. He sent the footage to the sergeant, then sat back and exhaled. He could have tried to confront them, but he knew better. Patience was more powerful than aggression. If they came back, he'd make sure it ended on his terms. The following evening, Jake got another idea. He decided to test them this time. He parked his truck 2 blocks away from his house and walked home through the back gate, staying out of sight of the main road. From inside, he turned off most of the lights, leaving the house looking dark and empty from the outside. Then he waited. It was almost 11 when he saw movement through one of the front cameras. 2 figures walking slowly along the sidewalk. One pointed toward his house. The other stopped near his driveway, looking around. Jake zoomed in on the screen. Same height, same build, it was them. They weren't knocking this time. They were observing. The taller one pointed toward the porch camera, whispering something. Then he took out what looked like a flashlight and shined it briefly at the lock before putting it away. Jake stayed completely still, watching every move. His phone buzzed again, another motion alert from the side yard. The second man had moved around to the fence. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, the men turned and walked quickly back toward the street. A car door slammed and the sedan drove off again. Jake recorded everything. This was enough proof that they weren't just pretending. They were preparing for something. The next morning, he met with the sergeant again and handed over the footage. The officer watched quietly, his expression serious. "They're testing your security," he said finally. "Probably trying to figure out when you're home. They'll likely try one more time." Jake nodded. "Then I'll be ready." The sergeant gave him a look. "Just don't do anything that'll get you in trouble." "Let us handle it," Jake gave a small smile. "I'll stay within the lines." But deep down he knew he wasn't just going to sit by. If they came back, he'd make sure they didn't fool anyone again. Not in his neighborhood, not anywhere nearby. That evening he set things up carefully. He adjusted his outdoor lights so the cameras could catch clear angles. He also placed a small sensor by the gate that would send a silent alert to his phone if it moved. Then he waited. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Then, just as he was about to stand up, the alert buzzed again. Gate opened. Jake moved quietly to his desk and opened the live feed. There they were again, same 2 men, moving slowly through the yard. This time they wore caps pulled low and gloves on their hands. They were careful, but not careful enough. The taller one motioned to the other, pointing toward the back door. The younger one nodded and moved closer. Jake kept his breathing calm. He watched as they stepped right under the bright floodlight and froze as it clicked on automatically. Both men ducked instinctively, shielding their eyes. The taller one looked straight up at the light, muttered something, and turned to run. But just as they reached the fence, red and blue flashes appeared down the street. The patrol car, right on time. Jake exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He hadn't called anyone that night, but the police had kept their word and stayed close. The car screeched to a stop and the 2 men ran in opposite directions. Jake couldn't see much from the cameras beyond the fence, but he could hear shouts echoing down the street. After a few tense minutes, everything went quiet again. Another notification popped up. Officer requesting homeowner statement. Jake stepped outside. The cool air hit his face as he walked toward the flashing lights. The sergeant was there along with 2 patrol officers. The younger suspect had been caught near the corner, sitting on the curb, looking defeated. The taller one had gotten away for now. The sergeant turned as Jake approached. "Looks like your house flushed them out," he said. Jake nodded. "Guess they didn't expect a welcoming committee." The younger man didn't say much. He just stared at the ground, hands cuffed behind him. He looked less like a hardened criminal and more like someone who had made a bad choice and followed the wrong crowd. "They're going to talk," the sergeant said quietly. "We'll find the others soon enough." Jake just nodded again. He wasn't angry, just disappointed that people would go this far to prey on others. When the police left, Jake stood in his driveway for a long time, looking up and down the street. The lights in the neighboring houses were still on. A few curtains moved as people peeked out, checking if everything was okay. He gave them a reassuring nod. "All good," he called softly. "They're gone now." Inside, he sat back down on the couch and looked at the security screens one last time. Everything was still. The yard was empty again. The air felt lighter. He leaned back and let out a long breath. The danger wasn't fully gone, but he knew the worst part was over. They had tried to test him to see if they could fool him, but they had underestimated who they were dealing with. The next morning, he brewed his coffee and stepped onto the porch. The sun was just rising, painting the neighborhood in soft gold. The breeze carried the faint sounds of birds waking up. It felt different this time, like the calm had meaning again. He looked down the street where the police cars had been just hours before and whispered to himself, "That'll be the last time anyone tries that here." Then he smiled, took a sip of coffee, and sat down, watching the day begin. The morning after the arrest felt strange. The sun rose like any other day, and the street looked calm again, but the air carried that quiet tension that lingers after something big happens. A few neighbors came out early, standing in small groups, whispering to each other. They had seen the flashing lights the night before, the police cars and the officers moving around Jake's yard. Now everyone wanted to know what had happened. Jake didn't say much at first. He gave polite nods and simple answers. "It's being handled," or "Police are on it." He didn't want to stir fear or cause gossip. Still, he could feel their eyes following him as he walked back toward his porch, coffee mug in hand. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. It was the sergeant. "Morning, Jake," the voice said. "Got a few updates for you. Mind coming down to the station?" "I'll be there in 20, Jake replied. When he arrived, the sergeant was waiting with a folder in his hand. He motioned for Jake to sit. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the scent of too many long nights. "We got some information from the guy we caught," the sergeant began. "He's talking. Says there's a bigger group behind this, not just your neighborhood. They've been hitting several communities in the area." Jake nodded. "Figured as much. They were organized?" "Yeah," the sergeant said, flipping open the folder. "Turns out they're not just thieves. They've been targeting specific homes, ones where the owners are known to have firearms, safes, or valuables. They pose as HOA or code officers, sometimes as delivery inspectors, even pest control, anything official looking to get inside." Jake listened carefully. The sergeant went on. "They gather information first, who lives there, what security you've got, where you keep things. Then they come back a few days later when you're not home. Sometimes they break in, sometimes they sell the information to other criminals." Jake leaned back in the chair. "So my place wasn't random?" "No," the sergeant said. "You were on their list, but they didn't expect you to be." "Well, he smiled faintly. "Your background probably changed how that went for them." Jake didn't return the smile. "What about the one who got away?" "We're working on it," the sergeant said. "We've got footage of him from your cameras, plus a partial print off the earpiece you found. It'll take time, but we'll get him." They sat quietly for a moment. Then Jake asked, "How many neighborhoods are we talking about?" 7 confirmed so far," the sergeant said. "They moved from county to county. We're coordinating with other departments now." Jake nodded slowly. It made sense. The fake badges, the fake paperwork. It was too well practiced for a one-time thing. The sergeant leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "The guy we caught said something else. Said the one who escaped was the planner, the brain of the group. He'd send others to test homes first. He was careful and never used his real name, never showed up in person unless he thought it was safe. Jake crossed his arms. So he might try again. Could be, the sergeant admitted. But now that we're involved, he'll probably lay low. Jake stood up and looked out the window for a second. The parking lot outside was half empty, just a few police cars gleaming in the sunlight. You ever notice how some people think they can just take what they want from others? He said quietly. They always think no one's watching. The sergeant nodded. Until they knock on the wrong door. Jake turned back, his expression calm but focused. If he comes back, I'll know. He left the station with a small sense of closure, not satisfaction, just understanding. The kind of feeling that came from knowing the truth, even if it didn't fix everything. Back home, the neighborhood was alive again. Kids were riding bikes, someone was grilling in a backyard, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and barbecue sauce. It was almost like nothing had happened. But the looks he got from his neighbors said otherwise. Mrs. Carter walked over from 2 houses down, her face worried but curious. Did they tell you what that was all about? She asked. Jake nodded. Yeah. Turns out those men weren't just scammers. They were part of a bigger group targeting houses like ours. Her eyes widened. You mean other people around here could have been next? Possibly, he said. But the police are on it now. They caught one of them. She shook her head slowly. I can't believe people do things like that. In a place like this, Jake smiled softly. Bad people go where good people feel safest. Makes their job easier. Mrs. Carter sighed and looked at his cameras. You were smart to have all this. Habit, Jake said simply. Learned a long time ago to trust my gut. Over the next few days, the police presence around the neighborhood increased. Patrol cars drove by at odd hours. Officers knocked on doors to warn residents about the impersonation scheme. Flyers went up at the local grocery store and coffee shop. Beware of fake HOA or city inspectors. Jake watched all of it quietly. He didn't like attention, but he was glad people were being warned. A few nights later, he was sitting in his living room when his phone buzzed again. It was the sergeant. Thought you'd want to hear this, he said. We caught the second guy. He tried to use one of those fake badges again in another county. Got stopped before he made it to the door. Jake exhaled slowly. Good work. There's more, the sergeant added. We found a storage unit tied to the group. Inside, we discovered stolen items, jewelry, electronics, even documents. But here's the thing. There were files on houses. Photos, notes, layouts. Yours was in there. Jake was silent for a moment. Layouts? Yeah, the sergeant said. Detailed sketches. They must have been watching for weeks. Jake felt a cold wave of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady.
How long until they're all caught?
We've got leads. It won't take long now. When the call ended, Jake sat still, staring at the wall. The idea that strangers had been studying his home, trying to plan their way inside, didn't scare him. But it bothered him deeply. It wasn't just about his things. It was about being targeted. About someone trying to violate the peace he had worked hard to build after years of living in chaos. He stood up and went outside. The night air was cool, the sky clear. He looked up at the stars for a moment and thought about the men he had served with, about how danger had always been part of his life. But this was different. This was home. A few days later, the police held a small meeting at the local community center. Residents from several neighborhoods showed up. The sergeant explained the situation, warning people to always verify identification and never let strangers into their homes without official notice. When it was over, a few people came up to Jake, thanking him quietly. If you hadn't caught them, they might have come here next, one man said. Jake just nodded. Just did what anyone should do, pay attention. As the crowd cleared, the sergeant walked over. Thought you might want this, he said, handing Jake a printed report. Case file summary. It's mostly over now. Jake flipped through it briefly. There were photos of the fake badges, the car, and the storage unit. It was surreal seeing it all laid out, a whole operation brought down by 2 men who had picked the wrong house. Later that night, Jake sat on his porch again. The street was quiet, washed in pale light from the street lamps. Across the way, someone's sprinkler clicked on, sprinkling the grass. The world looked normal again, peaceful even. He leaned back in his chair and let the night air fill his lungs. The hum of crickets and the soft rustle of trees filled the silence. For the first time in weeks, his body relaxed. He knew there would always be people who tried to take shortcuts in life, people who thought deceit and fear could get them what they wanted. But he also knew that calm vigilance was stronger. He took a slow sip of his coffee, then smiled slightly to himself. All that training still comes in handy, he murmured. The camera light on his porch blinked faintly in the corner, steady and reassuring. The neighborhood had learned its lesson, and so had the imposters. Some battles didn't happen overseas or in uniforms. Some happened quietly on your own doorstep, with nothing but patience and awareness. Jake looked out across the sleeping neighborhood and whispered softly, "You picked the wrong street." The days that followed felt strangely quiet. The police cars stopped coming, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful routine. People went back to mowing their lawns, walking their dogs, and chatting at mailboxes. But something had changed. Everyone seemed a little more alert now, a little more aware that safety wasn't something you could take for granted. Jake noticed it too. Every time he stepped outside, someone would wave or stop by to talk. They asked for advice about security systems, cameras, or just how to spot when something doesn't feel right. He was polite and patient with everyone, happy to share what he knew without sounding like an expert. He had always been private, not one to seek attention, but he realized something important during those conversations. People didn't just want protection, they wanted reassurance. They wanted to feel safe in their homes again. One Saturday morning, the local community center invited him to speak. At first, he didn't want to. He wasn't a storyteller, and he didn't like being in the spotlight. But the sergeant encouraged him, saying it could help others. So he agreed. The day of the meeting, the room filled up fast. Families came with kids, older couples sat in the front, and even a few police officers showed up. Jake stood near the front, dressed casually in jeans and a simple shirt. When he started speaking, his voice was calm and honest. "I'm not here to scare anyone," he said, "but I want you to understand something. Bad people don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they smile, wear uniforms, and sound polite. That's how they earn your trust." He paused, letting that sink in. The crowd was silent. "When those men came to my door," he continued, "they acted like they were doing their job. They had fake IDs, fake papers, even a story about new rules from the homeowners association. And for most people, that would have been enough to let them inside. But something about them didn't feel right. That feeling, that small sense that something's off, is what saved me." He looked around the room. We all have that instinct. We just forget to listen to it sometimes. You don't have to be a soldier or a cop to protect your home. You just have to pay attention. Someone raised their hand and asked, "What should we do if it happens to us?" Jake smiled gently. "You don't need to be confrontational. Just ask for proof. Tell them you'll call the HOA or local police to confirm their visit. Real officials won't mind, but the ones pretending will get nervous. That's when you know something's wrong." A few people nodded, taking notes on their phones. Another person asked how he stayed calm. "The training helps," he said with a small grin. "But mostly I reminded myself that panic doesn't solve anything. When you stay calm, you stay in control. Fear gives the other person power, and I wasn't about to hand mine over." The meeting lasted over an hour. People came up afterward to thank him, shake his hand, and share their own experiences. Some even admitted they'd once let strangers into their homes without thinking much of it. As Jake left the center, he felt something unexpected, a quiet sense of pride. Not the kind that came from being strong or brave, but from knowing that maybe, just maybe, his story could help someone else avoid the same danger. That evening, the sky turned orange as the sun dipped low. Jake sat on his porch again, his usual spot for thinking. The same street that had once felt ordinary now carried a new kind of peace. It wasn't the naive kind. It was stronger, built from awareness and caution. He watched a young couple walking their dog, laughing as the puppy chased a leaf. Across the street, a teenager washed his car, music playing faintly from his phone. Life was back to normal, but better. People were looking out for one another now. His phone buzzed. It was a text from the sergeant. "We closed the case." The last member of the group turned himself in. "Thought you'd want to know." Jake smiled faintly as he typed back, "Good to hear. Tell your team thanks." For a while, he just sat there listening to the sound of crickets and the faint hum of the evening breeze. He thought about how strange life could be, how danger could come disguised as routine, and how peace could return after chaos if people stood together. Later that week, the local news did a small feature on the incident. They didn't mention Jake's name directly, just called him a retired military resident who helped stop a series of impersonation scams. Jake watched the segment quietly, sipping his coffee. He didn't need recognition. The quiet safety of his home was enough. But what mattered most to him was the message that came after. The reporter ended the story with, "Authorities urge residents to stay alert, trust their instincts, and verify all officials before allowing access to their property." That single message, that one simple reminder, could save lives. A few days later, Jake was back to his regular routine. Early morning runs, fixing small things around the house and checking in with neighbors from time to time. Every now and then, he'd notice someone installing a new security camera or reinforcing their front door. It made him smile. One afternoon, a delivery driver pulled up. Jake stepped outside, cautious but polite, and asked for the delivery ID before signing. The young driver laughed lightly, saying, "Guess people around here don't take chances anymore." Jake chuckled. "Not after what happened. It's not about fear. It's about being smart." As the van drove off, Jake looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted lazily overhead, and a warm breeze carried the smell of cut grass. He realized how different things felt now. The world hadn't changed much, but his outlook had. He thought about how easily things could have gone wrong that day. If he had ignored his instincts, those men might have succeeded. They might have taken not just his belongings, but the sense of security that made home feel like home. But they didn't, because he trusted that quiet, inner voice, and the same one that had kept him alive in tougher situations. A few weeks later, Jake attended a small neighborhood barbecue. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few families, some burgers, and good company. At one point, one of the kids came up to him holding a paper badge he'd made out of cardboard. "Look," the boy said proudly, "I'm an HOA officer." The adults laughed, and Jake smiled warmly. "That's a good one," he said, patting the kid's shoulder. "Just remember, if you ever meet a real one, ask for ID." Everyone chuckled, and the moment lightened the mood. But beneath the laughter, there was an unspoken understanding. They all knew what could have happened, and how lucky they were to have avoided it. As the evening went on, someone handed Jake a plate of food and said, "You know, you really saved this neighborhood." Jake shook his head. "No, I just paid attention. You all did too. That's what matters." The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as the barbecue wrapped up. People said their goodbyes and headed home, waving as they went. Jake lingered for a while, watching the lights come on one by one across the street. When he finally walked back to his own porch, he paused by the door and looked around. The camera light blinked softly, steady as ever. The air was calm, the night peaceful. He sat down in his chair, took a slow breath, and smiled. He wasn't thinking about what had almost happened anymore. He was thinking about how it had brought people closer, how a scare had reminded everyone to look out for each other. Sometimes, he thought life had strange ways of teaching lessons. He took one last sip of coffee and looked toward the quiet street. Then, almost to himself, he said with a small grin, "They knocked on the wrong door." And with that, he leaned back, letting the soft hum of the night surround him, calm, steady, and unbroken.